So good afternoon, and thank you all so much for joining us for today's program. My name is Melissa Loriano, and I serve as the Programs Manager for the DC Preservation League. For those of you who may be new to DCPL, we are a citywide nonprofit organization dedicated to preserving and protecting the historic built environment of Washington, DC. I'd first like to take a moment to acknowledge some of DCPL's top sponsors whose annual financial support helps underwrite free public programs like this one today. They are the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, Denton's, Douglas Development, Antunovich Associates, Atlantic Refinishing and Restoration, Bayer Blender Bell, Building Innovation Hub, EHT Traceries, and KCE Structural Engineers. Also, as part of our 50th anniversary celebration this year, November programming is dedicated to highlighting row houses and alleys. So I'd like to take a moment to thank Betsy McDaniel, a resident of Bloomingdale and a longtime DCPL supporter, for generously sponsoring this month. And thank you to you all for your dedication to historic preservation in DC. So with that, I am so pleased to introduce you all to today's speakers. Kim Hoagland is Professor Emerita at Michigan Technological University, where she taught history and historic preservation for 15 years. Previously, she served as the senior historian at the Historic American Buildings Survey of the National Park Service. She has written 5 books on various aspects of American vernacular architecture and is currently working on one on Washington's row houses. Her involvement with the topic began in 1979 when she volunteered to work on the downtown survey being undertaken by the DC Preservation League, then known as Don't Tear It Down. Sally Berk has an undergraduate degree in architecture and a graduate degree in historic preservation. She's been a preservation activist in Washington for more than 3 decades, winning the city's award for the Lifetime Achievement in Preservation and serving for 3 years as president of DCPL. She's been studying Harry Wardman for decades, having written her thesis about his row houses. With Caroline Mesrobian Hickman, she co-curated the exhibit A Century of Wardman Row House Neighborhoods, and co-authored a chapter about Wardman in Housing Washington, 2 Centuries of Tradition and Innovation, published in 2010. And her website is wardmanswashington.com, which I will put in the chat momentarily. So with that, I am so excited to pass things along to Kim.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm going to start off with the 19th century story, and Sally's going to pick it up with the 20th. So in 1934, there were more than 51,000 row houses in Washington, far more than any other type of housing. So today, I'm going to concentrate on one and use that as a way to get at larger ideas of design and function. Our case study house is at 1524 T Northwest. It was built as an investment property in 1891 to 92, and O.C. Green, trustee, was listed on the building permit as the owner, and the builder was John T. King. I'll return to the people involved in this story later. It was one of a row of 7 bay-fronted brick buildings, all 2-story, each 17 by 35 feet with back buildings. The one we're looking at is the 3rd one from the left. There's a certain similarity, but in this row, the facades are differentiated by brick ornament and window shapes. And also the end and center buildings have pyramidal roofs on the end. This is an ensemble, not a strictly repetitive row. The plan consists of 2 main rooms with a side hall plus a kitchen in the back building, and on the 2nd floor, 3 bedrooms. So now I want to think about how this building works. How does the design make this house function? First of all, it gives us a separation of spaces. So the parlor and the dining room are separated from each other and from the hallway. The kitchen is in the rear wing, and there are doors between everything. On the 2nd floor, there are the 3 bedrooms all are accessed by the hallway, and each are separate, although the front 2 are connected by 2 doors. With this arrangement, there's a direct line from the kitchen to the front door. So if you have a servant working in the kitchen, presumably she can answer the front door without going into any of the public spaces. And so this is in some ways an arrangement that favors servants. Something else that indicates that in this building is the appearance of speaking tubes in the upper right. These were located from the second floor hallway and bathroom to the kitchen. So it's clearly, we're talking about servants here. And these, with speculative row houses, these features aren't idiosyncratic. If it's in one building, it's in the whole row. And the advertisements on the left show how popular this was at the time. These are ads from 1892 when this house was completed. And apparently speaking tubes were the thing that you wanted to be able to advertise in your new house. The second thing I want to look at is the location of the kitchen, which is the rearmost room in the plan, farthest away from the most formal public room, but also notably on the first floor. In Washington row houses, kitchens were often in the basement in the 19th century, even as late as the 1890s. And this is, of course, much better if you have servants to do the running up and down the stairs. Here's a house that's a little fancier than the one we're looking at, with a parlor, library, and in the back room, the dining room. Between the dining room and the library is the pantry, which I've blown up on the right. The DW in the corner does not stand for dishwasher, it stands for dumbwaiter. So the food would be hoisted up from the kitchen, from the kitchen basement via the dumbwaiter. The stairs down to the kitchen are also pretty prominent in this little room. And clearly this is a room that was used for food prep. But only the last minute prep, the cooking, is being done downstairs in the basement. The next aspect I want to consider is light and air, because this is one of the problems with the row house. It's bound on two sides. Our house is lot 44 here, actually. So how do you get light and air into a building where you have only two walls to deal with? In this house, they use several techniques for enhancing both light and air. First of all, there's a bay window in the front. So this house faces north, and so in addition to air from north and south, you'd also get air from east and west. It also has an extra wide window in the dining room and a little jog here in the rear wing to make that space even bigger, so they would be more likely even to get light and air. In the front bay window, there were operable shutters that would control both light, air, as well as privacy. On the second floor in the master bedroom, there was an interior window. So this is the front room looking towards, this is the connector to the adjacent bedroom. This is the doorway into the front hall. And here we have an interior window. This is it seen from the other direction. So there's that interior window. And also over the stairs, a skylight. This was an important feature on the theory that hot air rises, that all the hot air in the house would come up and through the stairway and up out the skylight. Also visible in this photo are the transom windows over the doorways, again for airflow. And one thing that's not so clear, but the floor to ceiling height is also pretty good. On the first floor in this house, floor to ceiling height was 10 feet, on the second floor, 9 feet. And then finally, important to the way a house functions is the utilities. This house is a little unusual in having not one, but two bathrooms. On the first floor, a half bath, sink and toilet. On the third floor, 3 fixture bath, sink, toilet, and tub. It's not unusual that there be a bathroom. Toilets were required in new construction beginning in 1877, so 15 years before this house was built. Tubs weren't required until 1907. But the fact that there are 2 of them is a little unusual. There's running water elsewhere in the house, of course, in the kitchen here, and also in the basement where the laundry would obviously be done. For heating, this house is equipped with Latrobe Stoves. This is a stove patented by the famous architect's son. And it's a coal-fired stove designed to go into a fireplace opening. So this house did not have central heat. It had stoves. It was heated by stoves. And for lighting, it had gas. In the 1890s, electricity for the homes was just coming on. This could have had either. Some had both, but this one had gas. So what we have is a middle-class house with mixed messages about modernity. It has 2 bathrooms, but no central heat or electricity. It has speaking tubes and hallways suitable for servants, but an upstairs kitchen accessible to a housewife. It has a fashionable facade, but it's a small house, just 1,650 square feet over the 2 stories. Now that we've looked at the what, where, when, and how, let's look at the why. Why a brick house, first of all? George Washington's building regulations, issued in 1791, just as the very first lots were being sold here in the new city of Washington, required brick or stone construction. This regulation was soon suspended because the city needed workmen, and workmen couldn't afford to build brick or stone houses for themselves. Wood frame houses are much cheaper and more expeditious. But the requirement for masonry was reinstated with exceptions, and by 1877 was required in all of the l'enfant city. Fire prevention, of course, being the primary concern. So Washington would be a red brick city as depicted in this 1884 view. Second question, why a row house? George Washington's regulations also provided for row houses by specifying how party walls would be built and paid for. The party wall, of course, is the one that's along the common lot line. And you can imagine there'd be a lot of disputes about this. Row houses were built in the city from the very start. And this, of course, is Wheat Row in Southwest, dating from 1794. This is a very grand row house. As you see, so it's on the first floor, 2 parlors. In the basement is the dining room in front and the kitchen, as I'm talking about basement kitchens. And on the 2 upper floors, bedrooms. Also a side hall. So again, a circulation space where you would separate out servants and people who hadn't quite yet been admitted into your parlor. And this house is extraordinary in being 26 feet wide. That's very wide for a row house. More typical would have been something like this, which is 14 feet wide. This leaves no room for a hallway. You would enter directly into the front room. Then the plan is a simple 2 rooms with a winder stair in the rear corner. The fireplaces would be on the partition wall, or we're on the partition wall. And so it's a 2-room plan. The living room or parlor, whatever you want to call it, in the front, the kitchen in the rear, and then bedrooms on the upper stories. This was the basic plan of a row house, either with a side hall or not, for the first 50 years or so of Washington's existence. Although row houses weren't all that necessary because the city was slow to fill with buildings, and row houses are most needed in dense urban environments. The next question is why an L plan? Why is this plan shaped like an L? And we'll now look at another house just to kind of shake things up a little. This is the house that Carter Woodson acquired in the 1920s, but by then it had been in existence for 50 years. It was built in the 1870s. So why an L plan? Well, first of all, you might want more space in your house, more than just 2 rooms deep. And one way to make a row house bigger is to add a room, but if you just slap one on the rear, then the middle room gets no light or air. So what you do is you narrow the wing, and then it gets light and air. The second room still gets this window onto the court. And this is the front of that building in its row. Very handsome row, not a bay window, but a very, very elegant row. Light and air were not only a matter of comfort to late 19th century residents, but also a matter of health. In the 19th century, or in the late 19th century, most Americans believed that illness came not from germs, which was a new theory not yet widely adopted, but from poisons in the air. These could generate spontaneously and were not detectable. So the solution was a constant flow of air, hence the various design adaptations we saw in the T Street building. And this is a diagram from the period that shows good air and bad air, and where is the bad air coming from and how do you control it, and so forth. This was kind of an obsession in the late 19th century. There was a problem with the L plan though, which is that the court, the space created in here by the back building, tended to be dark and damp because it was right next to another back building. These L's are called the back building. And so it was according to the new germ theorists, places like this seemed like a perfect place for breeding germs. And this is the court depicted in our T Street building. At the T Street building, the court was only 4 feet wide. In other houses like this one, this court is 6 feet wide, but the building is taller and the back building is longer. So it still is dark and damp. Finally, in 1905, municipal regulations demanded a wider court, which made the L plan so common in row houses not practical anymore. And Sally will talk about what happened next. Another way to make a row house bigger, as I mentioned, was to add a third room. This left the windowless middle room, which then was used mostly as a stairway and stair hall and circulation space, which the architects called a reception room or a reception hall. In other words, you're not going to hang out in this space. This house in Bloomingdale illustrates 2 creative ways to light that middle room. And I'm also including this because Row House Month is sponsored by Betsy McDaniel, and she's the one who got me into this house. So thanks, Betsy. So note the V notch in the back building here. This is again trying to increase light and air into the dining room and incidentally into the pantry, but into the dining room, and then with the theory that it would spill over into this reception hall. And wide doors in between all these rooms, of course, to help with the flow of air. The other innovation was this conservatory shown here. This was a 1-story glass-roofed greenhouse. The idea is that light would pour through this greenhouse into the dining room and also into the reception hall through this doorway, which had a glass pane in it. The developers, Middaugh and Shannon, claimed to have copyrighted this innovation, although I could find no record of any copyright. And it was something of a disaster, with residents reporting leaks and breakage almost immediately. And all of these conservatories have been roofed over. Here's the row of which that building is a part. But it shows how interested and how important light and air were in the design of row houses right at the turn of the century. The final why question I want to look at is why a bay window? Bay windows, as we've seen, are desirable for many reasons: health, as we've been talking about, comfort, and genteel status. But how were they enabled in Washington? This goes back to the L'Enfant plan and its excessively wide streets. And here's a detail that this street is 90 feet wide, which if you were the city and had to pave it 90 feet wide, it would be very expensive if you think about the entire street system. So the solution was to pave part and turn the rest back to the homeowner. So on this street, they paved 32 feet of the street, 12-foot wide sidewalks on each side, and then the remaining 17 feet, colored in the light green, are turned back to the homeowner and that homeowner can fence it in and garden it, but plant it. On a wider street, this is East Capitol, which was 160 feet wide, 50 feet is paved, 15 feet are sidewalks, and the adjacent houses have 40-foot deep front yards. And this is another wider avenue. What happened is that this space that people think is their front yard also provided space for bay windows. In 1871, Mayor Bowen issued a regulation permitting bay windows to project onto the public space, the public space that people think is their front yards. And these bay windows could provide very elegant spaces inside, as you see here with nearly floor to ceiling bay windows in the Bethune House. In 1877, these bay windows were permitted to extend the full height of the building, but had to be masonry. And the bay window thus became a popular feature of aspiring upper middle class row houses. So finally, we get to the who of this house. Who is behind all this? Begins with Joshua Pierce, who owned much of Rock Creek Park, plus some blocks near DuPont Circle. When he died, his nephew, Joshua Pierce Klingel, inherited everything. And so in 1891, Klingel decided to develop part of this land, and that's why these 7 row houses are here. Klingel's man at Washington Loan and Trust, O.C. Green, handled everything, even appearing as owner on the building permit, as I mentioned. Green hired John T. King, a reputable builder who served as secretary of the Builders Exchange. No architect was listed on the permit, but King also called himself an architect at times and clearly was responsible for this design. The owner, Klingel, probably never saw the houses and died a few months after their completion in 1892. The property passed to his daughter, and here the story gets complex and even sordid. I can't go into it all. It's very complicated, but the story involves an elopement, an alleged murder by poison, a Confederate general who probably never existed, a composer of light opera, and an early death by apoplexy brought on by the obnoxious mother-in-law, according to one source. At any rate, Susan Juliet Gay Beatrice Klingel, first married Darling, second Spranger, inherited the row houses. After her death at the age of 28, her 2 children, aged 5 and 7, were orphaned, and they inherited the houses. The family trust rented the houses out to a variety of residents. So there were several degrees of separation between the owners and the tenants. And in fact, at this point, the owners aren't even living in DC. But there were lots of renters passed through this house. For example, in 1900, the house was rented to Jared Smith, who was a botanist at the Department of Agriculture, and he lived there with his wife, son, and an African-American cook. In 1910, it was rented to William Lockwood, a clerk at the ICC who ran a dental supply business on the side, and he lived there with his wife, 3 children, and a boarder who was a white dressmaker. Once the Darling children reached their majority, they sold the houses. In 1919, John Thomas, an African-American chauffeur for a private family, and his wife, Susie, bought this house. This was part of a trend. In 1910, the entire row had been white renters. By 1920, it was all African-American occupants, most of them owners. The Thomas's neighbors were a lawyer, a teacher, and government messengers. After John Thomas died in the 1930s, his widow, Susie, took in boarders. In 1940, she added a room onto the end of the back building here. And I don't know whether it's so she could live there and her boarders had the upstairs, or whether she just wanted a nice sunny room on the south side, but at any rate, there it is. Also, the separation of spaces in a plan like this is good for boarders, right? Everyone gets their own door and no one has to walk through anyone else's room. And then you can also close off these more formal spaces downstairs. Susie Thomas died around 1970, having lived in this house for 50 years. There's also, of course, a why to the who. Why did this neighborhood shift from white to African-American around 1920? It's complicated, but of course there was an influx of population during World War I, and whites had started moving to areas beyond the L'Enfant Plan, north of Florida Avenue, and they restricted their new neighborhoods to white-only residents. And I'll put in a plug for Sarah's tour on Saturday, which is of Bloomingdale, and Sarah will be talking about covenants and deed restrictions. But back here in the old city, the African Americans began moving into these older row houses. So in our little house, we've seen absentee landlords, which were 3 generations of a family, a number of renters, always in flux, and homeowners. Homeownership was unusual, with only 30% of Washington's households owning their own home in 1920. And for African Americans, it was even more rare. Only 14% of African American households were owner occupied, but John and Susie Thomas managed to carry it off. And this was one virtue of the row house, especially an older one. It was affordable. Row houses, by definition, are on small lots. And as I mentioned, this was, of course, one among many row houses in the city. And this chart is taken from data provided by Brian Kraft. So thank you, Brian, showing some of the trends. And what the yellow line are all buildings constructed in a year. The green line are speculative row houses. And what we see are some peaks in the 1880s and 90s, which I've been talking about. Then again, around 1910, and even more in the early 1920s, and Sally will address those. We also see how single-family houses begin to overtake row houses. The blue is all speculative dwellings, and you see in the 20s that that becomes quite important, and that row houses really sort of fall off during and after the war. And part of that was that it had to do with how strictly they were zoned and confined to certain areas, but that's a whole nother story. So in conclusion, this one modest row house helps us understand how row houses in Washington worked for a variety of occupants, families, servants, boarders, renters and homeowners, blacks and whites, for a variety of uses as a home and as an income producer for both absentee landlords and homeowners, and as an expression of ideas about health and comfort. For a building that is subject to so many constraints, from its abutting neighbors to numerous building regulations to the exigencies of the marketplace, the Washington row house has remained the mainstay of housing options in the city, and to me at least, the most significant. So now I'll turn it over to Sally, who will continue the row house story through the lens of one builder.
So this slide is a demonstration of the fact that Wardman built Wardman, the most prolific residential developer in the history of Washington, built not only row houses, but a variety of building types, including hotels and apartment buildings and a few office buildings. But it was, and his name became a household word in 1917 with the construction of the Wardman Park Hotel, which was enormously successful. But in fact, for almost 20 years prior to the construction of the Wardman Park Hotel, Wardman had been a very, very busy man. He built he was responsible for twice as many buildings as the next two prolific developers of his time, and thrice the number built by the Bruningers, for whom he worked at the beginning of his career. Of these 3,000 buildings, 400 are apartment buildings. A few are other types, but the vast majority are row houses. Wardman was born in Bradford, England in 1869. I learned when my husband and I went to Bradford, England, that school was not required at that time. But I have to assume that Wardman must have gone to school, was quite literate, quite bright. And the photo on the left, it's my left, I guess it's your left. Wardman's in the center, and it looks like, and he's 15 years old, and it looks like a class photo. By 1906, when Wardman had been in Washington for 13 years, he was he was 37 years old. He was a very successful, very wealthy man, primarily because of row houses. And in 1927, when he was 58, he was king of the world, or king of Washington, 2 years before he went bankrupt. And I don't think I need to tell you why in 1929 he went bankrupt. But at that point, it was well known that he was worth $30 million, which in today's dollars is $459 million, or almost $250 million. There wasn't anything the man couldn't afford, and more about that in a little while. He was born in the textile city of Bradford, England. His whole family were factory workers for generations before him, all his siblings, cousins, aunts and uncles, and he was a Babendorfer as a child. And and as you can see, the houses, tiny, tiny houses, as you can see in this plan, were built surrounding the factory so that inclement weather didn't prevent the workers from getting to work. And this unbelievably modest house on the right was one of the 3 houses, all like this, that his family lived in. When he was a child, he left alone. He left Great Britain at the age of 20. But until then, he lived with his mother, his father, and 3 sisters, 6 people in a tiny house like this, with 1 floor, 1 room on the 1st floor, and 1 room on the 2nd floor. And as I'm sure you all know, the row house was the most prevalent building type in all of Great Britain. And when he was a child, there was a popular English jingle of the 1870s that went this way: "The richest crop for any field is a crop of bricks for it to yield. The richest crop that it can grow is a crop of houses in a row." So he was inculcated as a young child as to the value of row houses. He came to Washington in 1893. It isn't where he first went to New York, and I'm not going to tell you about all of that, but the country was experiencing a recession in 1893, and Washington has always been somewhat insulated from that because of the federal government. So he came to Washington in 1893, and in 1890, this house was constructed in 93. Wardman lived in it in 98. I find it difficult to believe that he could have afforded this large house. I don't know if in fact he rented rooms in it, or whether I've noticed that a lot of rows, the end house is actually what at that time was called apartments. But at any rate, this is where he lived in 1893. And 5 years, and he worked, he actually laid floors at the Willard. He worked for Thomas Franklin Schneider for a while, a fabulous architect and also prolific developer with whom Wardman eventually became competitive. 5 years after arriving in Washington, he was able to do a project with a fellow Brit, financed by a very successful Washington tailor for whom Wardman had built a house. And the tailor financed this project of what I call row houses. They are identical in plan. Of course, the end one may be a little larger. Identical in facades, in detailing, and using details, ornament ordered from catalogs. They're 8 feet apart, but they are in a row, and I call them row houses. And this first project of Wardman's was the formula that he followed for the rest of his row house career. Unfortunately, he lost money on this project and didn't build. Oh, that's where that up Georgia Avenue on Longfellow Street is where that project is, 2.5 miles north of what was probably then Boundary Street, but is now Florida Avenue. And above, this is when the city was outgrowing the original L'Enfant Plan city. And as a result of, I think Kim already told you, an enormous influx of population. There was an incredible housing shortage when Wardman came to Washington. as a result of, one, the influx of population after the Civil War, for the Civil War, during the Civil War, and then another influx of population as a result of the federal government expanding so enormously. So the land north of Boundary Street was platted out in the late 19th century. The streetcars began extending outward, and Wardman took advantage of every opportunity to develop houses in those vicinities. But having lost money on his first project, his next project, for which he was only builder, not developer, was this project for the Washington Sanitary Improvement Company, a philanthropic company. And for those of you who don't know what philanthropic housing is, it was intended for the lower income population. It was financed by the by anybody willing to invest some money at a lower interest rate than you could obtain from banks, hence the philanthropic aspect of it. Wardman was only the builder on this project, and what you can't see is that there are actually 2 units to each building. These were his first row house flats. And these houses were built for both white population and Black population, but not integrated. The whites were on one block and the Blacks were on another. And this is where the philanthropic houses are located, but also this project, which Wardman commenced as both developer and builder, only 2 years after working on the philanthropic housing, realizing that there was a lot more profit to be made if he were the developer, not only the builder. And this project, about 4 years ago, was landmarked as a result of the DC Preservation League submitting a landmark nomination, which thrilled me. I wish that more Wardman projects were protected this way. But at any rate, here's the plan of these row house flats. And they are more, they offer more than the flats in the philanthropic houses did. In this instance, here's living room, bedroom, dining room, kitchen combination. All of the rooms are entered from the hallway rather than through one another. And all of the rooms have windows, which wasn't true, I think, of the philanthropic housing. And also, Wardman, this is a project in Bloomingdale, but Wardman did not present, when he built row house flats, he did not present 2 doors to the street. There was one entrance, then you entered and you were presented by 2 doors, or if there were a 3rd floor flat, 3 doors. And the reason was that people who lived in row house flats, from the street, they could not be distinguished from single family houses. And in fact, there are examples of Wardman building row house flats and single family houses interspersed, and from the street, you can't detect which is which. So let me see, in 1903, he did that project on Florida Avenue of row house flats that got designated and is called Wardman Flats, I believe. That same year, he commenced on his first project of front porch row houses, although very modest ones. At the same time, his first apartment building. And this apartment building is simply 2 row house flats joined by a foyer, and then constituting an apartment building of 6 units. I think it was probably economical for Wardman to build them this way, but it did in fact constitute an apartment building. And at this point in his career, and perhaps for all of the first decade of the 20th century, there was this dilemma of what was going to be the more popular housing type. Would it continue to be single-family row houses, or would the apartment building become more appealing to people? And in 1906, let me find this. One of the newspapers printed an article saying at one time, this was 1906, I said that. At one time, it was supposed that apartment houses would largely take the place of individual houses, and that owing to the convenience of living in such a way, as well as to economies in certain directions, like you don't have to take care of your trees, people would naturally drift into the large buildings. Experience has shown that this has only taken place in part, and while the accommodations offered in apartment houses have been taken to an extent that constitutes one of the wonders of the current market, the demand for individual houses continues. And Kim's chart inspires me to attempt a chart of just how many dwelling units Wardman built, or perhaps in the first decade of the 20th century. How many dwelling units were constructed in apartment buildings, and how many dwelling units were constructed in single-family houses? Were they about equal? Did the apartment building take over? At this point, I can't answer that question, but I sure do wonder. So then in 1904, Wardman commenced construction in Bloomingdale. And this is my chance also to thank Betsy, who lives in Bloomingdale, for the work that she did in it and finally getting Bloomingdale designated historic district. With my partner, Caroline Mesrobian Hickman, we tried in, I think, 2006 we made a presentation to the people in to property owners in Bloomingdale, and tried to convince them how all the value, all the benefits of being a historic district. We failed, but Betsy and her colleagues succeeded. So here in 1904, Wardman began construction of row houses in Bloomingdale. It was still early in his career. He still needed to obtain financing. And so many of these projects were done with existing developers like the Bruningers. But here's a project that Wardman did on his own in 1904 with Nicholas Grimm as his architect. And Nicholas Grimm had been the architect of that row of freestanding houses on Longfellow Street, because Wardman was smart enough to partner with an established row house architect. So these are 1904 row houses in Bloomingdale by Nicholas Grimm. The next year, here is a very similar but not exact row, but designed by the architect Albert H. Beers, for a reason that unbeknownst to me, Wardman and Beers parted ways somewhere in 1904. And Wardman began a partnership with Beers that was mind-bogglingly prolific. Beers tried to introduce some variety in the rows. You can see here's octagonal bay, square bay, octagonal bay, square bay. He often succeeded in producing or designing variety in the rows, but Wardman didn't always go along with it. And of course, what price the houses went for often determined just how much variety were in them and how much detail. Here is Beers' drawing of a row with a great deal of variety. And then in 1907, Wardman bought a tract of land from the Holmead estate, about founded on the west by 14th Street. This was in response to the streetcar line being extended up 14th Street beyond Florida Avenue. This was his initial purchase of land from the Hoagland estate. So I like to call this project Hoagland Village. Caroline and I met with residents there and were not successful in convincing these people to consider a historic district designation. And to this day, it still is not. In this project, Wardman invested a great deal of money with Beers as architect, and there is a great deal of variety in the houses. But what is most important is, and here it is along 14th Street. And you can see by the red dots that Wardman actually expanded his construction in that vicinity after this first project of 1907. But what is the most important about this project is the new plan, the daylighter plan. It didn't originate with Wardman and Beers. In fact, it was being constructed in Baltimore maybe even a decade prior to this construction. But for Washington, it was new. And because Wardman built so many of them, he was responsible for the institutionalization of the front porch row house in Washington. A contemporary newspaper called this a semi-suburban house. It wasn't freestanding, it wasn't Cleveland Park, but with generous front yards and this shallow floor plan. What a contrast to the 19th century floor plans that Kim showed, only 2 rooms deep with a generous foyer, plenty of light penetrating to the dining room, depending on the time of year and the time of day, penetrating maybe 75% of the room, also and so the shallow plan facilitated putting this front porch, which of course creates shade, but the rooms were still bright and pleasant. This plan was largely the result of a change in lifestyle, a more familiar, a less formal lifestyle. There is no parlor. The family gathered in the living room. There is, fortunately, the foyer, you don't just enter into the living room, but it was a much more casual lifestyle with this project. And it started with Wardman building 250 houses in this project. No developer, no one in Washington had ever approached that magnitude prior to Wardman commencing on this project. At the very same time that he was building the front porch houses, the daylighters in Columbia Heights, and Columbia Heights had a great deal of panache at that time, and one could expect a pretty dollar, could ask a good price for the houses there. The same was true of Woodley Park off of Connecticut Avenue. The streetcar line had recently been extended up Connecticut Avenue, and Wardman was able to purchase land, actually, eventually a great deal of land along Connecticut Avenue. But at any rate, in 1908, he constructed this row of front porch row houses. And although it's very difficult to photograph it and discern the fact that it is, in fact, a composed row. If you start at the ends, it's like A, B, C, D, E, and the center is F. Very hard to see, and especially since unfortunate changes have been made. But like the composed row that was Kim's first image, Wardman, and the interiors of these houses are highly detailed with plaster paneling on the living room walls and doors that folded into the wall, separating the living room and dining room. And Wardman never did anything like this again. What happened? Did I go backwards? Wardman never did anything like this again. He must have found it to be not very profitable. Then in contrast to the luxurious houses in Holmead Village and in Woodley Park, in 1912, Wardman built a project of far more modest houses on Hobart Street, bounded on the east by Georgia Avenue and the west by Sherman Avenue. And they have only 2 bedrooms and a bath on the 2nd floor. You enter into the living room, there's no foyer, but the plan is very similar, just more modest, similar to those in Holmead Village and Woodley Park. They are in close proximity to Howard University, but they were not bought by Blacks. It was a long time before that neighborhood changed. Wardman was just not, as a matter, well, you'll hear more later. Here, now. Wardman was not averse to capitalizing on the stratification of Washington. And he put racial and ethnic restrictions on the majority of his projects. Most of them west of Rock Creek Park. The Commission of Fine Arts was established in 1910. Early in its existence, it issued an edict that row houses should be prohibited west of Rock Creek Park. I think it was one of the greatest factors in the stratification, the bifurcation of Washington, east and west of the park. And Wardman also, although extraordinarily wealthy by 1920, cashed in on the phenomenon, or that Kim described, of white flight, even in the early 20th century, and then Blacks buying the houses that they vacated. But the Blacks had to buy them at a very high price. And Wardman was not adverse to buying up rows of them and then turning around and selling them for a great deal of money. So sadly, Wardman came from stratified Bradford, England, managed to escape, came to the United States, became extraordinarily wealthy in Washington, but was not at all averse to reinforcing the stratification that existed in Washington and still exists. This is an example. These houses in Sheridan, Colorama, now Obama's neighborhood. These houses demonstrate that it's just 2 sets of 3 houses. To me, they're a demonstration of the fact that no matter how busy Wardman was with large developments, he never passed up a chance to buy a piece of land wherever it was and put appropriate housing on it. And in 1920, Herbert Hoover, then Secretary of the Department of Commerce, issued a call to all Washington developers to respond to the terrible, severe housing shortage that existed in Washington by building more affordable housing. Don't we all know that term? And so Wardman responded by constructing houses on, oops, can you see that? Land that he owned way up Georgia Avenue between Peabody Street and Somerset Place. He wanted to build row houses, and the people in the neighborhood objected. So NIMBYism existed 100 years ago, and he instead built these semi-detached and in some instances 3 in-a-row houses, 3 attached houses. People said they were still row houses, but he made them so affordable that I think Herbert Hoover was probably pretty pleased with it. And this house now with white siding, unfortunately, 613 Somerset Place, is the house that I lived in when I was 5 and 6 years old, that my great grandmother had bought and rented to my parents. And so early in my life, Wardman was a part of it. And this is a photograph of the presidential cavalcade going through Fort Stevens in 2009. And I have to admit, I don't remember why Obama was there, what the occasion was. But the neighborhood looks pretty good, doesn't it? And that's where it's located. This is a photo of an English garden village just outside Bradford, England, where Wardman spent the first 20 years of his life. And one of these houses he purchased in 1926 for his parents. He returned every year to visit his parents in England, and was very aware of what the housing movements were in England, and the fact that there was this English garden movement. Of course, it had begun in Forest Hills in New York even earlier, so he could have been aware of that as well. But anyway, using that as an example, as an example, he constructed what he called English Village, and he named all his projects and all his apartment buildings with British names. In 1924, the same time that he began the Fort Stevens project, Fort Stevens Ridge, east of Georgia Avenue, of very modest houses, he commenced construction of these rather high-end attached houses off of, there we go, between Connecticut Avenue and Reno Road. And just as in Fort Stevens Ridge, the neighbors complained that they were row houses. But he did, in fact, he said, he testified at a hearing that it was very, very steep, sort of unbuildable land, and that the neighbors should be pleased that he was willing to develop the land. And as you can see, they're not houses that we would be inclined to object to. So coming to the end, in a directory, a residential directory, phone directory of 1925, there was this Wardman ad that we house 1/10 of Washington's population, which very well may have been true. And I would estimate that today, millions of people have lived in Wardman properties. And if you'd like to know more about Wardman, you can find it on my website. And if I have time, I have one more thing to show you. When I was visiting Richmond a few years ago, I saw these houses near the Virginia Museum of Fine Art. And they looked so much like Wardman houses designed by Beers that I made some contacts in Richmond to find out, in fact, did Wardman and Beers reach out and do a project in Richmond? The answer was no, they hadn't. But what I learned was that this, in fact, was a pretty typical kind of housing in the mid-Atlantic part of our country in the first decade of the 20th century. So that's it. Thank you all for watching.
Well, thank you both so much for your wonderful presentations. I think we all learned a lot and they were really, really interesting. So we do have a couple of questions to start off with. And Zach, if you can hear me, let me know if there's anything from Facebook. But again, just so everybody is reminded, please put your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And let's see. So somebody mentioned kind of, would they be able to get a copy of the slides? I don't know if either of you object to that. We could like link that to our website if people want to kind of refer to those. But I will also say that the recording will be immediately available on Facebook after our presentation, and then it'll be on our YouTube channel in a couple of days as well. So Anne asked,
as far as access to the images that I showed, most of them are on my website.
that's a good point. Yeah, and I put Sally's website link into the chat, so you all can visit that if you'd like. Okay, so Anne asked, how was the construction of the entire block of row houses coordinated with the owners? So for example, the excavation of the basement spaces, the shared walls, and the roofs.
I mean, so generally it's one owner, right? The one owner building the row houses at the same time. What the party wall regulation had to do with was if one owner can build the party wall, and then when the second owner comes along, they have to reimburse the first owner.
Oh.
But it wasn't really foreseen that people would be doing this all at the same time. What was the second part of that? Basement stuff. Yeah, same thing.
Okay.
Right. Let me look at this question again. Yeah,
I guess
the roofs. Yeah. The roofs, of course, had to be separate. There were party walls in between, rising in between each house. The party wall had to, let me say that more clearly. The party wall had to extend up through the roof.
Okay, so Eric asked, this is specifically about his house. He said he has a 1915 row house, and there's a fireplace in the living room, which is very shallow, I guess less than 16 inches, and has a small flue. He said, I assume this was never for wood, but was operable for some type of heating device. What was it? I don't know if either of you.
All I can say about that is that in some of Wardman's houses, the fireplaces were operable. You know, they were intended for wood, and in some they were not. And so I can't answer about that specific house. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, that's fine. He also had another question, I guess. So my row house has a small 2-story brick extension off the rear, 2 stories. In the basement is a toilet, and on the first floor. Okay, Eric, I think I'm gonna like copy this and I'll send it to Kim and Sally afterwards, and then maybe see if they have any comments, and we can get back to you on that.
The toilet in the basement was intended for help.
Yeah, he had made that comment. And then he was like, there's evidence of an arched brick opening facing the rear porch, which is lower than a typical window, but which has been subsequently infilled. What is this room for? Was it a pantry and the opening for ice delivery?
Or
I
coal.
think that's possible.
Or
Yeah.
coal. Or coal.
Oh, okay. All right, well, that's good.
Can I ask if I could have another minute? I forgot to say at the end that the Wardman houses are viable neighborhoods today. Obviously, I think they're well worth saving, doing all that one can do to save them. They also they are good in terms of minimal emissions, you know, with thick insulating walls, and the row houses have only 2 exterior walls. So they are environmentally sensitive housing from a century ago, and many of them are easily adaptable to solar panels as well. That's it.
That's a good point. Let me see here. Somebody mentioned, Anne mentioned, what about the alleys? Like, is there anything that you noticed while researching row houses that you found out about alleys that might be interesting? for people
Yeah,
to know?
I'll take that. I think alleys are really important to how row houses work, because you need to be able to get out to the street to take out, to empty the privy or take out the ashes or, whatever. And so the fact that the Washington squares are so big and had alleys going through them, had room for alleys and so forth, I think helped make row houses work. There was access to the rear and easy access to the rear. Now in other cities, you'll see little passageways along the lot line between houses, and then they're built over on the top. But what Washington's alleys permitted was for, horses and wagons to get into the alleys to do the kind of removal of stuff. So yeah, I think they're very important.
What I forgot to say when presenting the houses in Fort Stevens Ridge, the ones east of Georgia Avenue, way about almost to the district line, almost to the Maryland line, that Wardman had said when Hoover said that Washington developers needed to respond to the serious housing shortage, Wardman did in fact develop that land, but succeeded in getting the blocks subdivided. The squares are half, I should have pointed that out on the plan. The squares are half the size of the, platted city. And so in that instance, it wasn't always possible to get an alley in, probably wasn't possible. And the garages in these modest houses, they still had garages, were entered from the street, not from an alley.
Good point. Yeah, and if anybody's interested in learning more about alleys in DC, the Historic Preservation Office put out a survey a few years ago that kind of goes into, well, obviously surveying alley structures that are existing and kind of recommendations for the future, and also just kind of their history. So I will try to get the link into the chat, but I recommend looking into that. It's very interesting. Let's see. So Jim asked, the Longfellow Street houses that were 8 feet apart were called row houses. I always thought that row houses had at least one common wall.
I call them row houses because they meet my definition of a row house. They have the same or almost identical floor plan. The facades are either identical or slightly varied. They are they use this, and they are built for, they're always speculative, and they're built for economy of means. And so even though they don't have party walls, they are in fact houses in a row, or row houses that are identical. And in Chicago and San Francisco, there are enormous projects of row houses that fit that description of being identical in plan and similar, identical or similar in facade, and built for economy of means to the speculative market. They're not attached, but I think that they too are row houses. They're not individually commissioned.
I disagree. I define row houses differently, as Sally and I found out immediately when we started. Because as you see, I'm really focused on the plan, and I think the fact that 2 party walls makes it a row house. But the interesting thing is that row house was not a term that was used in the 19th century. In fact, there are hardly any mentions of row house. In the I should have looked up the numbers, but something like in the 19 teens or aughts, if you look at the decade and word search it in the newspaper, there were 46 mentions of the word row house, and hundreds in the next decade, and then over 1,000 in the following decade. So it's a word that caught on in the early 20th century. So it's not like there's some immutable definition of row house.
But that could also be somewhat explained by the fact that the magnitude of row house projects increased dramatically.
I think it's also, though, because it's a snobby thing. They're looking down on it. They call it a row house. the more row houses were built, the less elite they became, and that's one reason that
It was more, there was more cachet in having a townhouse than in having a row house.
yeah.
Todd asked, was Wardman responsible for the large amount of row houses built around 1925 in Petworth?
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. I just couldn't show everything.
I was looking at parts of Petworth and found a lot of row houses built by both Dunnigan and K. Fritz.
Mm.
So, I think there are a number of developers building in really big numbers up there.
Mm.
K. Fritz definitely cashed in on the front porch row house.
Yeah, and Dunnigan as well. He gets less press, but he was very big in Petworth at this time.
Speaking of porches, Scott asked, he said, thank you both. Can one of you talk about the design and popularity of sleeping porches on the second floor of daylighters?
Oh, I'm so glad that somebody brought that up, because I neglected to mention that that Wardman did incorporate sleeping porches on the second floor of all of his row houses. And I'm trying to think if there was a relationship of I thought of it when Kim was talking about alleys, but actually no, there isn't a relationship between the sleeping porches and the alleys. There is a relationship between the sleeping porches and two factors: the prevalence of TB at the end of the 19th century. People slept outdoors because they thought it was healthier. My husband, who's a doctor, says the cold killed off more people than putting them on sleeping porches in the winter was not a good solution. And then the other factor in Washington for having sleeping porches is that before air conditioning existed, people slept outside. I even came across an article in the newspaper that people who lived in the vicinity of Meridian Hill Park would spend the night. You would sleep with your neighbors in Meridian Hill Park. So sleeping out of doors in a Washington summer was prevalent.
Yeah, I think also, let me just reinforce the health aspect of this too. I think as the germ theory caught on and people were afraid of, catch things from each other, the whole outdoor sunlight, get outside kind of thing became very popular. And sleeping porches had a pretty short run. They didn't come on until the late 19 aughts, so like 1909 or so. And then by the late 20s, they were seen as sort of trashy, stuck onto these buildings. It's a fire hazard. So it was a pretty brief run.
They got and of course, many of them have later been enclosed.
Yeah, sometimes hard to see.
So Betsy asked to Kim, thank you for the update on Maddow and Shannon. I have wondered about the possibility of a patent.
Oh.
Yes.
Yeah, I could not find it. So I think they were just blowing smoke, and it was a disaster. It was interesting, but it didn't work.
So Sarah asked, Sally, can you repeat which year it was that the CFA prohibited the construction of any more row houses west of Rock Creek Park? Could zoning regulations have superseded this, or did the CFA's ruling take precedence? Also curious how this works now.
Okay. No, I can't tell you the exact year, and I didn't say the exact year. I'd have to look up in the book that's the history of the CFA. But it was not long after the CFA was created in 1910. It was not long after that. And no, zoning did not supersede it. No. Mm-mm.
All right. Jim asks, some Bloomingdale Wardman had triangular staircases. Was that common? Triangular staircases?
What is a triangular staircase?
I'm not sure, but Jim, you can follow up if you have more details for that question. Elizabeth asked, how and why did Wardman go bankrupt?
Oh, he was overextended.
Mm.
He was avaricious and he in 1926 he built the Carlton Hotel, now the St. Regis. In 1927 he built the Hay Adams. In 1928 he built the Wardman Tower, and at the same time acquiring properties that he hadn't built. So he spent a year hysterically trying to climb out of that problem that he had created, and finally ended up selling a great deal of his property to other entities. And of course the stock market crash played a major role.
That's true. Okay, Anne asked, have you all done any research of the two-story row houses built along streets like Pickford Place Northeast, which were built as housing for workers building Union Station, between 8th and 9th Street Northeast?
Yeah, I don't know Pickford Place. It is a good opportunity to talk about worker housing, basically. So we focus on a little fancier housing, but there's row houses could be very plain as well. And a lot of them were, I mean, if you think about that 14-foot wide house I showed from the 1820s, that persisted pretty much through the 19th century. And finally, regulations required that houses be at least 16 feet wide, but then there were all these exceptions, so it really didn't have much effect. But so if you think about a 12 or 14-foot wide house, it wouldn't have a bay window, it wouldn't have a side hall, it would just be a very basic two-room plan. And they were built, I think, in the 1880s. I ran the numbers, and something like half of the row houses, the spec row houses, were 16 feet or less, or maybe less than 16 feet. I have to look that up. But there were a lot of working class row houses being constructed, and the same form ends up in the alleys. And so it's just a very, very plain, very narrow row house.
Wardman never built a house narrower than 16 feet. The most modest ones, the Hobart Street ones, and the similar houses in Eckington, they were all 16 feet wide, but without foyers, very minimal in plan.
By then, the regulations had gone into effect.
Yeah.
Sarah asked, might there be a case made for preservation of Holmead Village based on the social cultural history in addition to architecture? This might be more compelling for the homeowners. Maybe.
I would be surprised if that were more compelling for the homeowners, but if Sarah would like to give it a try, I'll go along with her.
Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay, Jim followed up with, I believe the triangular staircase were 120-degree turns, that as you rose, you went around a central triangular core, that you would look straight down. He said many in Bloomingdale.
120-degree.
Yeah.
I'm not familiar with that.
No. But it'd be nice to see pictures, Jim.
We're talking about,
yeah.
right, is a stair that ascends in 3 directions, right? You go up again, and then you go up again, right?
Yeah, and then you'd be able to see straight down. So.
Yeah. Which is a way to get a more, to make the staircase more compact, essentially, not extend like the full length of a side wall, but you'd put it like across a reception hall room. You might make that a little more narrower, but taking up less linear space and more of a square space.
Right. He said exactly. So.
Okay.
Do most row houses? Don asks, do most row houses in DC have the small staircase to the attic? What are examples of that? Maybe. Okay.
Attics are not always aren't a very common, I would say, because of the flat roof, the predominance of flat roofs.
Right.
I've seen, there are stairs to attics and attics that are fully habitable, and some are clearly designed for storage that you can't stand up in them.
Mhm.
And then some look like they might have attics, but don't at all.
Mhm.
Yep.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. So Rachel asks, my house on Capitol Hill has a steel beam from the front to the back in the basement. Was that a Wardman innovation? Does it help to date the house?
Not a Wardman innovation, no, not at all.
But
There-
definitely 20th century.
Okay.
But as soon as they could, as soon as that became economical, they're going to start putting them in there.
Okay. So let me see. Do we have any other questions? Let's see. Well, Jim asked, so are upscale row houses such as Old Town Alexandria called townhouses?
I'm sorry, what's the question?
I don't know. Jim just said, are
About how row houses became the word for sort of lower class housing, and he's wondering, well, what about upscale housing? But I would call them all row houses. And when the more upscale houses in Alexandria were built, they weren't called row houses, or they might have been called townhouses because might have been someone's in-town residence, which is older connotation of the word townhouse. Now, real estate agents love the term townhouse. Again, it sounds a little more posh than a row house.
Yeah, interestingly, now townhouses are built in the suburbs.
Yeah. They
Okay.
wouldn't think of calling that a row house.
And then Anne had asked, whom could I contact with an issue in an alley? I mean, you could email us, Anne, and then maybe I can direct you to the best person for that, depending on what the issue is in the alley. I just put our contact information into the chat, DCPL. So I'll say for anybody, if you have any questions after the presentation, you could always email us, and I will contact like Kim and Sally with a question, and hopefully we can get you an answer. Or if there's kind of anything else that you just think of that maybe you want to ask DCPL about, like please feel free to email us at info@dcpreservation.org. So with that, it is now 1:27, so I think we're going to have to end this here. But I just want to give a big thank you again to Kim and Sally. The presentation was absolutely wonderful. I think we all learned so much about Washington row houses. And I hope everybody takes the time to check out Kim and Sally's work and stay up to date on what they're working on. And please share the recording if you would like as well for folks that maybe weren't able to attend but would still be interested.